Right. Good afternoon. My name is Masego Madzwamuse. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Southern Africa Trust. Welcome to our Society Talks webinar series. Today we are talking about, the topic for discussion today is the rethinking of the social and economic order for the future and a feminist perspective. I have with me three sisters who are joining me for this conversation around rethinking the social and economic order. And the reason why we decided to focus on a feminist perspective is that we realize that if we are going to realize the dream of social inclusion in the post-pandemic, we have to rethink what was there before, and we have to begin to reimagine an alternative future. And it is time for inspirational leadership that has been demonstrated by a lot of sisters and a lot of commentators, experts who work in the feminist space. And they bring with them a wealth of insights that, through various platforms, that are provided through their own analysis that brings together an intersectional lens to a very complex problem and complex challenges that we're facing now. And these are building on years of work that they've been doing previously and years of messages that they've been sharing in various platforms that have seemingly been falling on deaf ears. Um, Thought leaders and activists have been asking questions around how we address inequalities through intersectional lenses, profiling the issues and the challenges that women face, that people within the LGBTQ community face during the pandemic and before then. There's been a lot of information that is shared in various platforms. We have seen a wealth of feminist analysis that is coming through various networks, the most recent being an open letter that was penned by a group of African feminists who are calling for a feminist post-economic recovery in Africa's economic reform agenda going forward. And there's been many other messages that have been shared before. And I have with me Âurea Mouzinho. Mouzinho. We were practicing this beforehand to make sure that we honor the right pronunciation. And she is a political economist and feminist activist. She's of Angolan descent, and her interests are in furthering research, advocacy, and movement building around issues of informality, inequalities, and macroeconomic policy from a feminist perspective. Âurea currently works with OSISA, and she's managing the Economic and Social Justice Program in Angola. Welcome, Âurea. We also have Hesphina Rukato, who is an author and development consultant, feminist. She's based in Harare. Hesphina is a Pan-African developmentalist based in Zimbabwe. Her vision is of economically, politically, and socially empowered African citizens with the capability to sustain themselves and with governments playing a facilitatory role in the upliftment of African citizens. And she has worked with the NGO sector, intergovernmental agencies, as well as with the private sector. Last but not least is Memory Kachambwa, who is the executive director of FEMNET. Memory is an intersectional feminist, a women's rights activist with over 18 years of experience on issues of gender and development. And she is currently managing a Pan-African feminist network and based in Kenya. Memory is a thought leader and strategist, and she's passionate about making a difference in the lives of women and girls using diverse approaches. I think we've got just the right panelists to share with us what a vision of a feminist, a vision around building and rethinking the social and economic order from a feminist perspective might look like. And I'd just like to start by inviting Âurea to share with us what that feminist perspective looks like, why it's important for us to have a feminist perspective in how we reimagine the future of our continent. Âurea?
Thank you, Masego. Good afternoon, sisters, comrades from everywhere in the continent, in the region, and in the world. I'm very glad to be here and share this panel with this powerhouse of feminist sisters. Masego, I think by this stage, all of us are aware that although COVID-19 starts as a health crisis, it really manifests as a crisis that is felt in the dimensions of care, a crisis of inequality, a crisis of injustice that is felt at, both at the level of social inequality, social injustice, and economic inequality and injustice, but also racial, as we've been made aware very recently. So these are issues that feminist scholars, thinkers, activists have been marshalling for years, decades. And in the continent, there's the issues that we've continuously engaged because in the understanding that women's marginalization doesn't result just from gender inequalities. So I think at this moment we stand and we look at the analysis that help us understand why we're feeling COVID-19 the way we're feeling, and feminist analysis is the lens through which we can explain a lot of the things that are happening. For example, why are poorer people more affected in some countries, why some countries can marshal some resources, why a woman, even though they might not be directly affected by mortality rates, are most affected by lockdown measures and so on and so forth. So I think it's indispensable to have all of this wealth of knowledge that feminism gives us, or feminisms give us, to understand this crisis.
Thank you, Âurea. I think you're quite right about the indispensable wealth of knowledge. And I would just really like to go around and get Hesphina's input again on the same question. Why is it important for us to have this feminist lens in understanding where we are, but also in shaping where we ought to be heading?
Thank you, Masego, and hello, everyone. I think I'll just start by giving an example of some work that has been done, some articles that have been written, which have demonstrated that the countries that have women leaders have been better able to deal with the COVID pandemic. For example, New Zealand and Germany, and I think Iceland, I think there's about 8 of them. And what is said in the African context is that we'll never know, because out of the 55 countries, we don't have one single leader. So we don't know how differently, if they had been there, they would have been able to deal with this issue. But I think the pandemic gives us an opportunity to effect or to challenge the existing platforms that have not enabled women to participate, not just in politics, but also in economics. If we look at all the aid that African countries have received, individually and collectively, they come from their male counterparts. They decide where the aid will go, how it will go, and the modalities of delivering on that aid. And one of the things that I thought of when the pandemic started was, I really miss my mother. The pandemic is not just about shortage of material, but it's also right now a shortage of spiritual support, emotional support, psychological support across the continent and across the globe. And those are issues that have not been discussed. How then do we expect people that have been affected this much to stand up tomorrow when the pandemic is over, hopefully it's going to be soon, and again engage in a better way in the global economic sphere than they've done before? It means we need to start now. And I think, especially from a feminist perspective, it shouldn't just be about what needs to happen to women or what women need to get. It's really, if we are the mothers of the more than 50% of the population, we honestly need to be lobbying and advocating for, out of the 55, how come we don't have a single woman who is a head of state at that level? Out of the billionaires in Africa, how many of them are women? So then it means we need to be working towards opening political spaces, economic spaces, and social spaces for women and girls especially.
Thanks, Hesphina. I think you raise an important point, and there has been a bit of controversy and pushback on, I think, what has been very clear analysis on how well countries that are led by women have been doing in responding to COVID. And I think demonstrating the importance of responses that address or approach this as not just a health pandemic, but one that requires psychosocial support, but also one that requires responses that are about understanding the structures of society, including the structures of the economies that most of the women head of states are leading. You make an important point about for Africa, we will never really know what that potential looks like. And I'd like to bring Memory here and ask her whether she agrees with that analysis. Do we have a missed opportunity in how we could have addressed the COVID pandemic simply because we don't have women in political leadership at the scale that we need to? And as a result of that, what are your observations around the kinds of impacts and the regional responses that we're seeing?
Thanks, Masego. I think picking up on the points that Hesphina has brought in terms of the leadership and who is really taking leadership along the continent, especially in response to COVID, I think it's really glaring that what we really needed is what we call feminist leadership in terms of responding, and what does that look like? And I think it's a sort of leadership that is centered on principles which really look at issues around equality, principles that are really based on centering the well-being of the population and having an intersectional lens. So I think the continent I think there's been what I can call a lot of clueless in terms of how we deal with this, in terms of really looking at what are some of the homegrown solutions. I think as a continent, we have the resilience with our experience from HIV and AIDS, with our experience from Ebola. But I think there's also the over-reliance on looking at the West and the northern countries as being the ones who bring the solutions, and not really harnessing our resources and looking within our own domestic economic potentials in terms of how do we really use this moment to call out and say, we are heavily burdened by debt, for example, and to really stand up and say, because it has to be just cancellation, and even to look at the solutions and not just depend on getting funding from the multilateral, the IMFs and the World Banks, which has conditionalities and which continuously indebts us. So I think we needed a sort of a leadership that would really, really look into see the alternatives that have been being pushed, particularly by the feminist movement, by social justice movements, alternative that really talk about creating healthy safety nets and an investment in the social infrastructures. I think for long we have ignored the impact that our health has been privatized, the social sector, our education has been privatized. So this is a moment to really look back and to look at all the all the opportunities and all the alternatives that are really out there, which are very transformative, which can really result on a paradigm shift and, you know, really looking inside in terms of internally, how do we harness the resources that we have, but also looking at equitable distribution and really centering on what we call the K economy, because we've seen the huge burden of the pandemic on care. And I think this is an opportunity for us to really start investing in the care economy. And like what some people are already postulating and saying, a caring economy, what does that look like? Hesphina talked about how she misses her mother, because when we talk about feminist responses, it's not, it goes beyond, it's a holistic, I mean, it's really centered on looking at the nuances around the power. You know, right now, you know, when you look at the burden of care, it's falling mostly on women, it's falling on girls, just the gender roles. We've really seen the issues that we've talked about, the increases in gender-based violence, that has a huge cost. We can see already, for example, women's rights organizations, civil society organizations, they're already taking that burden because the state had not invested enough resources. It has not, in terms of when you talk about the way it distributing resources to make sure, you know, there are adequate centers and all those things to create environments that are safe. You know, that has been really missing. And I think it's an opportunity to now relook and to also rethink even our means of production and reproduction. What does that mean? Can we really starting to reimagine? Without most of our borders locked, our informal traders not being able to trade, the majority of our economies being informal, how do we really start relooking and rethinking, but really centering on a well-being kind of economy? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Memory. I actually want to bring Âurea here and works on issues of informality and inequality, including just understanding this from a macroeconomic policy space. And Âurea, would you like to comment on what you have seen as the gaps in the responses so far, the COVID responses so far, but most importantly, also just touching on what you think the regional leadership needs to be paying attention to in terms of policy responses?
Thank you, Masego. I think I'll speak my point of departure on the gaps of the response, the relief response. We'll focus a bit on Angola because it's what I engage with permanently, and I think there's a lot of parallels with some of the countries, and the other sisters can probably contribute. But here, I think in April, the government announced 21 measures to sort of fight COVID-19 in socioeconomic fronts. Out of these 21 measures, the overwhelming majority of them focus on formalized economic activity and formalized businesses and small and medium enterprises. There was some of the response that targets small scale farmers, but most of it was through credit. And you know, like in most countries around the region, the overwhelming majority of African peoples work in the informal economy, particularly in the urban sectors. So, and we know of this informal economy, majority are women. So we didn't have a comprehensive response for the women that almost overnight were hindered from, you know, gaining their daily bread and feeding their families. An understanding is that the informal economy only is important for these women to subsist themselves, but it also serves as the basis for subsistence for people that can only buy from the informal economy because, you know, shops and all of these things are too expensive. So I think that was the glaring gap that we had, which combined with repression, because under lockdown, people couldn't sell on the streets. We didn't have a comprehensive idea of how most of Angolans most of urban Angolans particularly were meant to secure a subsistence, because it's not like people have a backyard farm or compound where they take legumes and all of that, since most people live in informal dwellings. So that for me shocked me as the major response, or at least where informality at the micro level is concerned. There was also a glaring silence on issues of domestic violence. In fact, our minister of the department that is akin to Women's Affairs, they closed response centers for domestic violence assistance. And we were just shocked to learn that, because women that face domestic violence are most vulnerable under this stage. So there was no idea of what the response would be, what kind of support women and girls could secure. We know, of course, that schools close downs were quite crucial, because it's a channel of transmission of the virus, but there was no alternative for all of those mothers that now have their children at home for longer periods of the day. And they single mothers, they parent, sometimes with other mothers or other community members. So there was no idea of what are they to do with these. I understand with these children. I understand that we learn as we go in terms of government responses, but this silence for the majority, we talk about the silent majority, was very concerning, because we saw, at least I saw, that the responses were targeted at specifically middle class and rich Angolans, and not necessarily to the working poor, the population, and women, which was very concerning. At least at the SADC level, I think in terms of leadership responses, my concern was that our government saw a lot happening in terms of rich countries, and Memory touched on this, being able to secure relief packages for the population. But to my knowledge, there wasn't a pronouncement of SADC leadership around debt. And we know that our governments are getting escalating debt bills because of the procurement that needs to happen to respond to the crisis. There was the G20 initiative, but a lot of analysis shows that for most of the countries, the lower income countries, that only covers actually part of the debt bill that is due for this year, and countries still have to pay a lot of money this year. So, and only covers bilateral agreements, not private lenders. So in a case like Angola, we have about the G20 initiative covering about 50% of the debt, whereas the other 50% is still unaccounted for. So we are going to still pay this money. And I don't know what necessarily is the situation in our countries, but our governments, at least Angolan government, is so subdued that they put the payment of debt as a priority on top, for example, of spending in social in emergency relief and social services. So we have, for you to have an idea, just the payment of debt interest, it's bigger combined of that budget for health and education combined for 2020. And then this is concerning for me, that there isn't we have seen some movements from the AU saying that, yes, we'll try to engage more deliberately about a constructive mechanism for debt restructuring, debt forgiveness and cancellation, but SADC hasn't had that response. And I think that SADC, leadership of SADC is, in many years, has been following in a way a more neoliberal, perspective, where they've made statements about macroeconomic stability, they've made statements about, improving the business environment, but in issues of political economy, they've been largely silent. And I think it's a time that at this time of crisis, it's particularly important that SADC leadership puts people's rights, puts justice, and puts a guarantee that there will be fiscal space to respond to the crisis on top of all the other botched priorities that we've been seeing in the last years. And final point, this goes also in line with reviving the SADC Tribunal, which, you know, has been very unfortunate that it's been shut down, but maybe deliberate that it's been shut down. But I think to have that mechanism of where the peoples of the region can engage with leadership and challenge things that happen in country would be very important. So I think that should be at the top of the agenda as well.
Thank you, thank you. And I really don't mean for most of the discussion to be centered around leadership being understood in the sense of from a state-centric point of view and taking away from the sort of agency that we need to see coming from citizens, coming from feminist collectives that we've been referring to. But I must ask this, Hesphina, knowing that you've spent many years working with inter-government entities, is really the question around what kind of leadership, actually, what will it take for us to see a kind of leadership that listens to the views of citizens, learns from the mistakes of history? I mean, what Âurea is saying around the impact of debt and what we need to be mindful of as we sign up new debt is not a new conversation. Mozambique, the impact of private debt on the underdevelopment of Mozambique is something that is so recent in our history that as we engage in more borrowing to respond to COVID, we don't need to look very far. So what does it take for some of these issues to gain traction and for us to begin to see within our leadership in the policy spaces being comfortable with exploring alternatives to the neoliberal system and agenda that we're seeing so far? Hesphina and memory, and then I'll open up to take comments from our participants. You're on mute, Hesphina.
What I was reading yesterday, or a video I was watching yesterday about Rwanda, and the lady of the Rwanda board, development board, was saying that one of or a few things that have made them succeed in addressing the pandemic is the issue of a partnership between government and the citizens, but also the issue of building trust between the government and the citizens. And I think across the region, SADC and Africa, that's one thing that has been lacking. And on social media, there's always jokes when the heads of state are going to address the nation. You address people, you talk to people. So there's no conversation and there's no dialogue. So it's almost like people that you were not talking to for so long, overnight, they're given a responsibility to save lives and they don't know how. They don't have the resources. And I think there's another joke that people crack that says, I think one president says, it's now all in your hands. It's like, what have we done? Why must this thing now be in our hands when before you have been the leader, you've been promising people health will be taken care of, the economics will be taken care of. Instead of actually creating jobs, jobs are being lost. And for me, I think the contradiction in all this, besides the borrowing, is the fact that we celebrate receiving aid literally to make us breathe, to make us live. Our lives as Africans depends now on Jack Ma bringing loads and loads of ventilators to Africa. And okay, tomorrow, when we live and we survive, what is the plan? And I think for me, again, it goes back to even ourselves, as I would say, we are so-called women leaders. Do we have that vision clearly? Can we propose it to someone? And I think my challenge to all of us is, if we think we know what that post-COVID economy, politics, and society needs to look like, let's put it down and we use it as our voice to say, this is the change we want, and this is exactly how it's going to look like.
Thank you, Hesphina. How do we move from celebrating aid that enables us to breathe to a space where we actually are clear about what our vision is? And the question from Hesphina is, do we have that vision, Memory? And if we do, what is the leadership? What should the leadership begin to do in terms of supporting appropriate response work within the policy and development space? Then we will open it up.
Sorry, Masego, before Memory, can I just say that one of the things that every government has, I think, is some form of COVID-19 committee, National Response Committee, or whatever name they've given it. And we are basically looking at how to survive tomorrow. And my view and proposal would be that while that one is working, can we put one in place that's going to be looking at country level, at regional level, post-COVID, made up of experts, not politicians. Politicians are good, we love them, but this one must be a multi-stakeholder mechanism that says these are the projected impacts across the board, and these are the plans we need to implement when we are clear of COVID.
Great, thanks, Hesphina. Memory?
Yeah, I think another interesting angle that has come in terms of the response is the way it's also being treated as a humanitarian response. So you find the platforms that do humanitarian response systems, the interagency systems. In those spaces, you don't really find, for example, women's rights, feminist organizations in those spaces. So it means that even the responses that are around COVID, they are also being treated as an emergency. This is something that will end, and once it ends, we'll go back to normal. And a colleague of mine says that there's no way we can go back to normal because there was something wrong with that normal. So I think the vision where you find it's a moment of really transition, and it really needs radical transition on all fronts when you talk of the political economy, when you talk about the social issues. So it should not just be confined in terms of as health crisis. I think that has been said, but we haven't really seen a vision that is saying, because of this crisis, the wake-up call has been for us to reorganize the way our economies are structured, to really question and challenge the global powers in terms of the global economic architecture. And I think we need to work very, very closely, particularly with our African leaders. I think this is the point where they should be really coming out and challenging some of those powers that control the global economy and the way of doing business, and say, because of the over-reliance on these systems and on economic powers, which are actually struggling now. So I think there's a need for that rethinking and really shaping a vision which is just not centered on COVID as a humanitarian crisis, but COVID as the benchmark to say, you know, when we talk about the Pan-African ideals, let's go back to those. Let's rebuild that as a continent, you know, let's strengthen our multilateralism system. Let's look at what, you know, how do we get civic engagement into these processes? Because what we are seeing is most of the African governments are becoming more authoritarian in this space. We have seen how they are over-policing, taking advantage of the lockdown, repressing the freedoms of expression, freedom of movement, even economic freedoms. So I think it's really where right now you don't know in this case, you know, over this period, you're right in terms of your representation, because even the structures, the parliamentary, all these accountability structures are being controlled. So rather than over concentration on how do we suppress and move this authoritarian agenda that we are seeing across the continent in a lot of countries, this repression, the shift should be around how do we really emerge as an African, continent that is really steeped in saying we are challenging the world order in terms of how things should be done, in terms of how economies should be restructured. I mean, this is a moment to really say, with all the resources in DRC, with all the minerals, our agricultural sector, this is a time to really say, okay, what do we have within the continent? How do we start restructuring? Who do we bring on board? And really start responding from that angle. So I think the vision should be really centered around it. And I really like the idea of, hey, what is really our vision in terms of what are we going to emerge out with?
Thanks, Memory. I think that very powerful interventions, and I really liked what you were saying about this is a moment for radical transition. But you're also asking, is that radical transition even possible within the authoritarian responses that we have seen so far? The social compact that Hesphina began to speak about between the citizen and the state, where is the space for that to happen under lockdown, state of emergency, suspended parliamentary business? What are the alternatives, and how do we begin to mobilize citizens' voices? And from the comments that we're getting is also a question around if we're going to begin to reimagine and even begin to re-engineer and bring in a feminist perspective to this. How do we even do that when there are no dominant political structures and the formal ones? And Lisungu says that national COVID-19 task teams, if you look at those structures, they painfully reflect the unequal distribution of power and access to policy spaces in the formal sector. And then Leila is asking a question: what approaches can older women in leadership play in grooming young women with potential? And I think this can be linked to the question that Hesphina was asking: is there a vision, is there a plan? And that question is, are they young women who are part of the process of shaping this vision? The alternative, I'm not sure it says pro one, and he says it talks of a resourceful woman. It's Proverb 31, which talks of a resourceful woman, and various countries, farmers, ministers, and so forth. We're being challenged here to around this whole notion about underrepresentation of women. And the question there is, the women who are in these different leadership roles, including the women who are driving the agricultural economy, why are they not advocating? Or maybe they should be advocating, is the comment. Then there is, from Sakina again, appreciating the issue that we are raising against, around gender-based violence. And there's another question that came from I've lost the question on gender-based violence, but I'm going to encourage that panelists please look at the comments and the questions and pick them up as we address this. But an appreciation there of dealing with questions of gender-based violence. A question from Malon is, what is the role of data in advancing feminist approaches to development in Africa? And then what is your assessment of the role of civil society and social movements? What is your assessment of the role that they have played, and particularly in helping us promote the well-being of girls and women? I'll stop here and then we can take more comments and questions that are coming through. And then also an appeal to the participants to ask short and succinct questions that make it easier for us to respond to them within this the given time. Who would like to go first?
I can go.
Yeah.
I would like to respond to the question on how older women can assist younger women in learning, knowledge transfer, and sharing experiences. I think one of the challenges we have is that very commonly we all see leadership at all levels as only political, or if you're in government or you hold a very high level position in the private sector. And I think that's the notion we need to actually debunk and begin to say, how can we engage ourselves as citizens at our own level? Because so many of us have certain experiences, have made mistakes, have done some good things as well. And it's important, especially for young people, to be able to hear. They don't have to accept it, but to know how the world works in certain spaces so that they get empowered as they also take the leadership roles. And I think these are things that will not happen in a government ministry or in necessarily a government institution. And I think it's a challenge to the older women also that we need to move beyond the intergovernmental or government spaces or what we used to, whether it's NGO. But on the issue of data and how it can be used for going forward, I think for me, this is one of the most critical aspects of what will need to be done to collect, to analyze, and use it to construct the vision we are saying we're going to construct. Because without it, we don't want waffling policy documents. We need now to be more concrete and use that concreteness as a tool to make change happen. I'm done for now.
Thank you, Hesphina, and I'll invite Âurea to take to step in there, and maybe as you step in to also just address. There's a comment here, question from Nomvula, which says we have to stop looking to governments, and where is the civic agency? So in addressing some of the questions that we are talking about, let's also touch on the civic agency. Âurea?
Yeah, thank you, Masego. And I think I'll build on Hesphina when she was talking about civic engagement and people's participation. And I think maybe because, you know, I was bred, my political consciousness arises as part of, you know, a feminist movement. I see the role of people as challenging power and different forms of power, right? So I think as young women, as people of Africa, of Southern Africa, we have this position to stand and challenges all the types of power structures that sort of bar access to resources or that advance autocratic processes that hinder the fulfillment of our rights. So I think the comment is right. I think Nomvula is saying that we need to stop looking for government towards leadership. But at the same time, I think we need to look for governments for accountability, because, you know, I'm no anarchist, and I do believe that African societies, you know, as much we need to fulfill or to counter the narrative of the emptying out of the state, because we in a region ridden with so many inequalities that we need, in our challenging of government, we need to be sure that, say, the state still has a role, and it needs to be a progressive role. Currently, our states are working towards the interest of, you know, multinational corporation, political elites, and we need to challenge that. We need to challenge towards the creation of an idea of the state that fulfills its mandate in delivering quote unquote development justice for the people. I think that's an important narrative that we need to drive, and also not be shy of occupying political space as a space for contestation. I think we've made so, what's the English word? To dislike political leadership, to be suspicious of it because of, you know, the deceptions that we've had. I don't think that everyone should be a politician, but I think there's role for leadership in political positions to claim that kind of power that also comes with engaging with other states and engaging on an international platform for the interests of our people and the continent. And this sort of touches on the question of whether do we have the kind of leadership to take on the world order that Nomvula asked. And I think we need to engage with leadership at all of these levels, as the people's power leadership, but also as a political leadership, the kind of leadership that's sort of brought independence, you know, that challenge colonial systems. Those are very sorts of processes that engage power, not just at the level of, you know, me and you, but also international world order. Maybe we are not there, but we need to work towards it. And that's the point I want to get about, you know, not forgetting that we need to continue engaging with processes of democratization, of strengthening movements. We've been made in this order, we've been made to think that individual achievement is what we all should aspire to. We've been made to think that our interests are best represented when I advocate by myself. But I think it's thoroughly important to remember that the spirit of collectiveness. And I think COVID brings a lesson, a fundamental lesson, that we are as weak as the weakest, right? So it doesn't matter if you have all the conditions to be on lockdown, you're still not gonna go outside as long as there are vulnerable people there that could potentially get infected and you know, sort of infect you and your family. So we need to remember this lesson and apply it to you know, to injustice, to inequality, and to be aware that we need this collective spirit to be reinvigorated. And I think across the region, we've seen a resurgence of feminist movements from Malawi to Angola, you know, South Africa. I won't even mention because of how potent the movement against gender-based violence is, but we need to look at this again for other realms of life. And I would be particularly excited, and I know FEMNET has been doing great work on this, on reinvigorating women's movements for economic justice. And I think it's important we start engaging on these matters. We start occupying space, you know, occupying space where space needs to be claimed. And I'll touch on one last question, which is the question of data. And I think data is important because it informs us, but also let's not be hostage to the idea that people only matter when, you know, they count. Beyond data, we need voice. We need, you know, we need people to matter not just as a bunch of figures, but to matter because they are holders of rights, they are citizens of this soil, or you know, and by citizens I mean the expansiveness meaning of citizenship, not just, you know, you were born and bred here, but yet the diaspora. So we should count because, you know, we are people that have our livelihoods dependent on this soil. So I think let's talk about data, perhaps more instrumentally and not as a means in itself, thinking that you put a report that does gender mainstreaming solves the issue. I don't think that's the way to go.
Yeah. Data on its own does not yield change. And I like what you're saying about, yes, we can talk about citizen agency, but let's not hollow out the state and relegate the responsibility of the state in showing up differently for its citizens. And I actually want to bring in Memory there. You invited her to talk about what FEMNET is doing around just building that women's agency, particularly around questions of economic justice. Memory, if you could also touch on the investments that are being made on young women to ensure this intergenerational continuity. And if we're thinking about investments in the political space and the role that women can play in disrupting power and facilitating the change that we want to see, in what way are we bringing young women along, creating the space for them? And sometimes it's not even just bringing them along, it's about creating space for young women to show leadership in areas that they're already leading us in already anyways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. So I'll just quickly share one of the things we are doing is we are working with both young women, but also African feminist macroeconomic activists. And it's simply just bringing together and building a movement of African women activists. They could be orthodox economists, they can just be, feminists, but just to really start working with them on macro level issues and also the link with micro, because we realize that most of the work around women's economic empowerment is really boxed around financial inclusion on micro level, a small business, but there are also issues, macro level issues that also impact on micro. So we are just building a movement of what we are calling African macroeconomic feminists, who are just who can really start questioning some of the structural issues around macroeconomics. And I think it's a very exciting work where we are bringing in young women as well, but also across the generation divide. I think one of the things that one president aspirant from here, Kenya, where I am, called Martha Karua, she was speaking and she was saying, you know what, young people, power is never given. You really have to get the power. But also, it's also taking advantage of the spaces. I think there's a lot of closing out of space, which is being occupied. And I think Âurea really spoke to how do we actually create spaces where young women can have a space amongst themselves as young women, but also within the mainstream. And we've been doing a new piece of work on actually engaging teenage and adolescent girls, because we find that the feminist movement or the women's movement in general, there's a place where the adolescents and teenagers are not actually coming into the movement. So you find they may be joining things like Girl Guides, all those clubs, but they get lost in terms of sometimes the political feminist consciousness. We are not investing a lot in that. So we are really working with adolescents, and they have really been amazing. We had a discussion with them around COVID, and it was just amazing just to hear a space where they speak for themselves on the issues, and you'll be so amazed around the analysis. So I think we have an obligation as women's rights organizations, networks, and movements in terms of having collective work where we also bring in and support young women with the capacity, with the knowledge, and also linking them, with the different global spaces. Because the global spaces within COVID right now, they're becoming more and more restricted, because if you are not given a Zoom link, there's no way you know that the African ambassadors are speaking or the African leaders are speaking on this macroeconomy. They're deciding on our issues. So even the spaces where we were invited to be in, they are not, we can't take it for granted. Processes are going, a lot is happening. A lot of agreements are happening. Trade agreements are being agreed on without our civic engagement. Governments are signing up deals with private sector companies. A lot is happening during this process, and we are already closed out already in terms of that. And I think to tap on the issue around data is, I think it's also important to always thread in. We've had a lot of questions on, but what is, why do you need macroeconomics and macroeconomics? there's nothing feminist around it. So I think it's also having, being able to have the data and the tools of analysis to really show that the angles which come in. So a good example is like the K economy. It's not included when you talk of fiscal monetary economies, when people are discussing the big macro level issues, they don't consider the K economy. It's not even counted in. Yet the contribution it makes in terms of the economy is humongous to the economy. And there are countries like Argentina which have actually they've actually included it, and it has created more jobs for women and for a lot of people who were outside. Also, I know Hawaii has it has also adopted a feminist COVID response plan. So I think it's not rocket science for us to have feminist economists and discussing those. I think we just need to grow the movement, and I totally support Âurea that it has to be collective action for us to really achieve a lot together.
Thank you. And I see that, time quickly runs out whenever we are having fun. Just as the discussion gets heated, I look at my clock and it's, oh God, time to. But before we wrap up, there is a question that keeps coming back. And there's a question here from Nomvula who says, is there, I hope I didn't lose the question. Do we have the kind of leadership in Africa that can take on the world order? And I think it's an important question because we've been talking about the need for radical change, the need to challenge the world economic order. And she's asking, is there a kind of leadership in Africa that can take on the world order? And is it the states that we look to, or this is the collective action that we've also all been talking about within the feminist movements, civil society, social movements, young people, and so forth? Just as that last question, and then we can wrap up.
Can I?
Yes, Hesphina.
I think for me, logically, we have the leadership, we have the world order. The fact that we haven't managed to make any great strides, for me, means that there's something additional we need, which is not yet in place. But if we also look back in history and acknowledge that we managed to politically overcome colonialism, I believe that we can, but it doesn't belong, it's not a challenge for political leadership alone. We need economic leadership, we need social leadership, we need all stakeholders, we need women, we need men, we need civil society, all the social formations. And I think I would say, if we take our collective leadership, yes, we have. It's just what does it take for us to do it?
Yeah, there's power in the collective, Hesphina. Memory, and then Âurea.
I think we do have that sort of leadership, and but the current leadership that we have is a leadership where most of it has not been democratically elected. So it becomes very difficult in terms of us really embracing the agenda of such. And I think we need to, as civil society, we need to continuously challenge a leadership that does not center the well-being of its civilians. We have to question what sort of leadership that is not conscious of its resources and how it can harness its resources and question some of the global power. So I think we are really hungry for a leadership that has the vision that we saw with the Pan-African ethos, a leadership that is really challenging and is not financed, it's not questioned, it's not apologetic of really saying and standing up. Because what we have right now in this crisis is a crisis where there's so much at stake in terms of the reach, the global powers. It's bigger, and it really needs a leadership that is definitely a collective leadership, a leadership that listens, and a leadership that also acts in terms of making sure we are having solutions around this COVID that is really transformative. And I'll say again, radical, that is bold, and that really pushes for the well-being and really talks about Ubuntu. So it really has to be a type of leadership that goes back to the core of us as Africans and really centers on that. A feminist leadership, that's what we need. If I can end on that note.
Okay, I don't know where Masego went, but maybe I'll build on what both of you have said and say that perhaps we also need a leadership, and I'm talking about people's, collective power that is also connected internationally. And I think as we rethink how we engage power at the world level, we shouldn't forget that a lot of the issues that we are facing as Africans are issues that are also faced by the peoples in other continents. So sometimes I'm disheartened by how much we don't invest in building these connections. For example, or between indigenous peoples here in Africa and indigenous peoples in the Amazon, between women's movements in Africa and women's movements in Asia, in Palestine, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to engage, because power is connected. Trump messages Bolsonaro, the messages Netanyahu, the messages Lorenzo. They're the same WhatsApp group. So we need to be on the same WhatsApp group as movements as well, because that's how we challenge power, right? And I think, yes, we need to build on this internally, challenging how people get elected in our countries and then get to represent us in international platforms, but also, build with people around, with movements around the world to also strengthen that power. And I think, I'm sure you've all read the statement, the Nelson Mandela Day lecture by the UN General Secretary, and how stringent it was in attacking, quote unquote, the botched world order that doesn't work for anyone apart from the elites and also the countries that establish itself on colonial basis and an exploitative basis. So we against a big fight. It's not a fight for a single person, for a single country. It's a fight that needs collective power. And I think before reinvigorating our movements just locally, we also need to invigorate the Pan-African movements, making these connections north to south within the countries. I come from a country that, for very many years and up to now, civil society continues to be very isolated, work in a silo. So how do we break that? How do we transcend these boundaries of language, these boundaries of resources, to be able to build collective power that can challenge a collective anti-democratic authoritarian surge?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Âurea. I mean, the point you make there around that power is connected, but also building collective power requires us rethinking and beyond. One last opportunity for all of you is just to say, but in just
Masego, you're dropping.
Minute. I will put it on. I'm going to ask to put that last question on the chat because my network is unstable right now. But it's after COVID, post-COVID, it, what does the Africa you want look like? Hello?
Hi.
Hi. Sorry,
Yeah.
my network is bad. I've switched off my Wi-Fi is not playing with me today. One last question for you all was post-COVID, what does the Africa you want to look like? Just 1 minute each. And you can take the opportunity to share your last thoughts, which you might have wanted to bring in. And Memory, I saw you putting your hand up. We'll start with you.
Thanks, Masego. So quickly, I just wanted to share and say the feminist movement had already demonstrated what the world should look like. And I want to just bring the attention of the South African women's movement, feminist movement. It was the one which led a shutdown South Africa way before, highlighting that a country that is centered, that does not respond to the violence of its population, of women, gender non-conforming people, that does not do that, it may as well shut down. So I just wanted to say, I think there has been a demonstration of even post-COVID that this type of economy will not work. Women marched to the stock exchange, showing the linkage that economies cannot survive if they do not consider this. It was the feminist movement, it was the social justice movement in South Africa also that started really showing the issues of racial discrimination with the roads must fall, the fees must fall. So there has been a demonstration way before COVID, which has shown that such a system cannot be sustained if it is a system of the future. So post-COVID, I think it's an opportunity for even the plans that are being postulated, the plans that are there. It's an opportunity to expand rights, to make economies fairer, to level up inequalities, and to challenge the systemic, the structural gender inequalities, all these imperialists, the racists, the neoliberalists, the capitalists, these are the ones that really exacerbate the well-being of us as African citizens, of women and girls in all their diversity.
Thank you,
that's
Memory.
the dream.
Beautiful future, beautiful dream, bold as well. Âurea, and then I will end with Hesphina.
Yeah, I couldn't add more to what Memory has said, apart from saying that this infrastructure of care that Memory is talking about, this public infrastructure of care that challenges, how access to rights, to services are being commodified in increasingly basis is important. But perhaps for me, just to add on Memory, would just say that this future that we want is not guaranteed, it's up for grabs. And so it's a rally for us to not cease, to get involved, to engage with movement building at this moment, even as we are socially distancing. So I think the challenge is for us to continue saying, how do we keep these issues on the agenda at this time to build the future we want? And to really direct all the sisters and comrades here to the beautiful, beautiful statement that, a constellation, I love this word, a constellation of African feminists put out on the post-COVID-19 economic recovery, which goes a long way into stating the vision of Africa we want, but the political economy vision, which is, could serve as a platform for us to start rethinking the future of Africa. Yeah, thank you.
Hesphina.
Hi, I was ready waiting to be directed. I think I would like to refer to what Âurea said earlier about the UN statement, the Secretary General statement. I watched parts of it around the fact that colonialism is still at work. And when we look at our leaderships, I believe that they still have that colonial hangover. And we need to find ways of unlearning what we learned through the process. If you look at our economy, if you look at our education that educates so many people that are unemployable or for whom jobs don't exist, those are the things that fundamentally we need to change. And I think there are many policy frameworks at the AU level, at the SADC level, at every country level, where promises have been made in national development plans, in regional development frameworks, Agenda 2063, NEPAD. There is many where we all have participated in one way or the other. We need to say, can we now move from the 10th floor, second floor, can we go in the field and implement? I think the visions are all laid out. And I think that's where I agree that Africa is up for grabs as well. We're not the only ones who want what is in Africa. The rest of the globe wants African resources. We sleep, we lose.
We snooze, we lose. Hopefully, we won't get to that point. Thank you so much, ladies. I mean, you've given us so much food for thought, and I would do a disservice if I was to attempt to summarize what you shared. But I will just do this by picking up on some of the things that you said that stood out for me. I think it's the first thing around what Memory was saying about challenging systemic inequalities. And I like what Hesphina, you just said, that in that process of challenging these systemic inequalities, we have to remember that colonialism is still at work. And so this is just, it's not going to be an easy process, but it's going to be a process of challenging power, challenging the current order at many levels. And it will take, it is upon all of us to unlearn. It is upon all of us to push our governments, to push everybody towards building the public infrastructure of care, and to end with what Âurea said about really connecting our power and building on our collective power. And it is through such platforms like this where we bring people from different aspects of civil society, activists, scholar practitioners, policymakers, civil society, people in civil society, to really be part of the process of changing the narrative and shaping a collective future, creating our own spaces, so we can stop complaining about how uninclusive the process has been so far. We're creating these spaces for citizen engagement, and would like to thank you for always turning up for these conversations on a weekly basis, and to our panelists for sharing their great insights. The last note is we kept referring to a statement that Âurea says was put together by a constellation of African feminist sisters. I also love that framing. But if you are interested in that statement, it's available on the African Feminism website, africanfeminism.com. Read the statement. If you identify as an African feminist, sign on. And Aluta, thank you for joining us.